All right, well, welcome back to the Pens and Poison podcast. My name is Liza. I'm your host. Really excited to have a very special guest with us today. His name is Eric Weiskott. Eric is a professor of English at Boston College, where he teaches and writes about poetry and poetics. He's the author most recently of the poetry chapbook, Chanties, An American Dream, and the scholarly monograph, Meter and Modernity in English Verse, 1350 to 1650, University of Pennsylvania Press. His debut full-length poetry book is Cycle of Dreams, and he edits the Yearbook of Lingland Studies with Alistair Bennett and Catherine Breen. His writing on literature, politics, and higher education has appeared in Atlantic, Vox, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Eric, thank you so much for being here today.
Lisa, thank you for having me here.
All right, so today we are going to talk about the English alliterative tradition. So we're going to go do a little bit of a blast in the past and talk about some older works of English literature, which have essentially established the foundation for what we might think of poetry as today in the English tradition. So Eric, why don't you start off, tell us a little bit about the alliterative tradition, what is it, what works embody it, and why is it important to us?
So the alliterative tradition in England is a now defunct mode of writing poetry that houses some of the greatest hits of medieval English literature. Beowulf, Piers Plowman, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight are all in forms of this meter. So it's a way of organizing poetic language, the same way you would say iambic pentameter is a way of organizing poetic language, but this is a different way of organizing poetic language.
Sure, and what are some of the features of the alliterative verse?
Well, as the name indicates, typically each line has a letter or a sound that it alliterates on. But more recent scholarship suggests that this isn't really the essential feature of this kind of poetry. And, metrics gets very technical very quickly. But to kind of summarize, scholars are now more interested in how the meter organizes stressed and unstressed syllables. And alliteration marks stressed syllables, but isn't itself the sort of thing that the meter's measuring. Like, again, to take a more familiar example, in iambic pentameter, that name is telling you that the meter is measuring 5 feet that are in an iambic rhythm, meaning unstressed, stressed. And for alliterative verse, we're still sort of arguing actually about what the forms that the rhythmical forms that the meter can take are. It's still an area of active disagreement in scholarship, but there is agreement that it's something more interesting and complicated than just the line has to alliterate.
Wow, interesting. Okay, and for our listeners back home who don't know what alliteration is, you want to explain briefly what that feature is when we talk about
Sure. So the first line of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is "Sithen the sage and the assault what cessed at Troia." So the alliteration is on S. 3 different words start with S in that line, and it binds the line together to have a number of different words starting with the same letter or really the same sound.
Okay, and we see the same feature in Beowulf as well in the Old English and the medieval English. Do you want to explain the difference between Old English and medieval English?
Sure. So Beowulf, we don't know exactly when it was composed, but it was written down onto parchment around the year 1000. So that's the period of English language history known as Old English. And then when you get into, so that's the beginning of the 11th century. When you get into the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, we instead start talking about Middle English, which is a different form of medieval English language, more similar to modern English, though still somewhat different. It's like 50% of a foreign language, whereas Old English looks almost like a foreign language. It's almost as difficult as German, because it has as yet no or very little influence from French. So the big dividing line in English language history is the Norman conquest of 1066. Once the people governing England are speaking French, that has a profound, delayed but profound effect on the language that we have inherited as speakers of present-day English.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually rereading Beowulf a couple of days ago. It was the last time I had seen it was really, really in high school. So
Yeah.
didn't actually study it in college for some strange reason or in graduate school. So,
You took Woody Allen's advice, that just don't take any class where they make you read Beowulf.
yeah. Well, I took a Chaucer class, so I have the Chaucer experience. I
Nice.
did my high school actually had Chaucer. I was the annoying kid who came in tried to read the Middle English in high school. That was fun. Like I speak German and French, so
Okay.
piece it together more or less,
Yeah.
and then picked up Beowulf and was looking at I had the Haney version where it's like the Old English and the Haney translation next, but I was looking at some of the Old English, and there are a couple of similarities to German. I couldn't really make sense of it that much, but I did see some words when I tried to read it out loud, and I looked up like the letters and some of the pronunciations. When I tried to read
Hmm.
it out loud to myself, it did sound a little bit like German. So that I found very fascinating that there is this like big Germanic influence, and then as you said, the Normans came in, and all of a sudden we have this big French influence. So I thought that was very interesting. And then I have actually this guy right here as well. And then I was reading the kind of Middle English here, which was
Hmm.
obviously a lot closer to our modern English. And I think, maybe I did sort of piece this together in high school when we were reading Chaucer and the Canterbury
Hmm.
Tales. But it is a much closer, rendition of the English language to what we might think of modern English.
Is that the Armitage translation?
That is the
Or
Armitage
okay,
translation.
cool.
Yes.
I have that
Yeah.
one too. Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah. There's
So
also
listen.
Marie Boroff and Casey Finch. Those are really the three for the Gawain poems.
Got it. Got it. Okay.
Simon Armitage only did Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but Casey Finch did all four poems in the manuscript. There are
Wow.
three other poems. The most famous other one is Pearl.
Pearl. Okay. I think I've heard of that. I will check this out. This is all a little bit new to me. My concentration was in modernist poetry, so
Hmm.
the other end of the timeline spectrum. So
Yeah.
I didn't do that much work with the older works, which is
Yeah.
good to kind of hear about this. I think it's definitely much needed for me as
Do you
well.
want to hear a little bit of Beowulf in the
Let's do
original?
it.
Okay. So this is the like scholarly standard edition, Kleber's Beowulf.
Okay, fantastic.
It was done by three different scholars in I think 2008. Okay, so here's the opening of the poem, and you might hear that it sounds a little bit like German. Unlike German, it has Old English and Middle English both have a trilled R, like Spanish
Oh,
or Scots English, a trilled or a flapped R. But other features of the language are reminiscent of German because of English and German both being Germanic languages.
sure.
So it opens like this: What we gardena in yer dagum, thed kundinga thrymje frunon, huda athlingas ellen fremedon. Oft shield shaving skedena thretum, monigum meigthum merdu setla of tiach. Eso de erlas, sidan erist wer fea skjeft funden. And goes on from there.
Oh, okay. Do you want to do a little bit of a translation for our audience
Yeah.
members?
So, lo, we have heard of the glory of the Spear Danes in days gone by, how the noblemen achieved great things. Often, Shield Shaving, who's this like legendary ancestor figure in the poem, deprived enemy troops of their mead benches from many of the peoples and frightened the noblemen ever since he was discovered a foundling. So his origin story is that he washes up on the shore in a boat, and the poet begins the whole poem by noting that from that humble beginning, he then becomes this fearsome warrior.
Yeah. Anything significant in the Old English in these lines that doesn't quite come across in the translation?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that can't come across in a
Sure.
translation, of course. The biggest one to me is just how syntactically knotted up the Old English is. In present day English, you have to kind of, we have lost a lot of inflectional endings, which means that word order is an even more important component of meaning. We can't just change around the subject and the object, then the sentence means something different. But in Old English, like in Latin, the endings of the words tell you the part of speech, and the case that a noun is in particular. And so you can switch things around a lot and it still makes sense. So if you were translating it word for word without adjusting the syntax the way I just did, it would sound kind of like nonsense. It would sound like, lo, we of the Spear Danes in days gone by, of the peoples, glory heard, how the noblemen great things achieved. So it sounds a little bit like Yoda. And this gives the poetry, this was an effect that poets sought. They didn't have to do this. Word order in Old English isn't all that different, really, from present day English in terms of everyday language. But in poetry, they wanted it to be ornate. They wanted it to be heightened. And so syntactical inversions and switching things around is part of that.
So this wasn't kind of a conscious mimicking of the Latin epics.
It's probably not a conscious mimicking of Latin, but it is worth saying that the culture that Beowulf comes out of is an Anglo-Latin culture. Yes. It's Beowulf is almost certainly written down by and arguably composed by a monk, and it deeply reflects a Latin literate Christian worldview, even though the content is secular and pagan. At various points, the characters are, even though they're supposed to be from the 5th century, they're like, and they're supposed to be from 5th century Denmark, where they're pre-Christianization, but yet they're still sort of praising a monotheistic God, and there are all kinds of subtextual references to Christian things in the poem.
Sure. So I actually did pull up the Wikipedia article before today, and I was reading that there are kind of two main scholarly interpretations of when this poem was written, and one camp of scholars believes that it was written in the early 900s, so kind of before Christianity, and another camp of scholars believes it was written maybe a little bit later, and it was kind of looking back on the pagan tradition. And if it was the first one, then a lot of scholars think that they added in the kind of Christian elements later on. Since this, I'm assuming was also similar to like a Homeric epic told in, an oral form rather than written down. Which one of those do you feel is most accurate?
Yeah. Well, so you've raised two really challenging issues about the poem. One, its date of composition, which is sort of notorious within the field for being like an acrimonious, decades-long disagreement. Basically, there's a camp of people who have always felt that it is early within the Old English period, which early in the Old English period means the early 8th century, like contemporary with the Venerable Bede, who's writing in Northumbria, in the north of what will later become England, in the early 8th century, so 700s. And then there's a camp of people increasingly vocal who feel that there's just not sufficient evidence to know when this poem was written. It could have been written in the 700s, the 800s, or the 900s, so we actually have 3 centuries to play with. And I tend towards that opinion. I'm not convinced that the evidence is secure enough, and here's why. If we knew the dates of all the other Old English poems, then I would feel more comfortable kind of guessing about Beowulf, because you could kind of compare it to the poems that we know the dates of and slot it in somehow through some sort of ingenious argument about its style or language or something. But we don't know the dates of any long Old English poems at all. We know the dates of a couple short ones. And so there's just so little to go on in terms of literary history. And you can see that in the way that people make an argument for an early Beowulf. It's almost always an argument about something that isn't strictly literary. Like, they want the poem to be early by showing that it has a lot of names of legendary heroes that, for example, more English people were called those names in the 8th century than in the 10th century. But like, okay, do poems have to have characters in them that are named things that their audience is named? I mean, this poem is set in the distant past, so it would make sense to be old-fashioned in the way people are named. So I just don't find that kind of extra literary evidence very convincing. And then the second issue you raised was its form of, dissemination. Was this chanted in the mead, atop the mead benches of early medieval England, or was this a monk sitting in a cell copying out, a poem that is pretending to be oral? Because within Beowulf, there are scenes of these sort of minstrel-like figures called shops, S-C-O-P, shops, that sing the story of the past within the poem. So that it's an idea that comes from the poem, that poetry, like you said, the Homeric epics, are transmitted orally. We're not sure that is or is not the case for this poem. That's another completely deadlocked controversy. It's certainly the case that the text we have, it has things in it that only someone who was Latin literate could put in it. So insofar as it's integral, insofar as it's one unit and not like 10 people's work, that person has to be a literate person. But yes, that there is this sort of older strand of scholarship that hasn't completely gone away, that wants to see it as like the Homeric epics being possibly composed of layers, the earliest layers of which may have been authored by like people who didn't have as much access to literacy. But the last thing I want to say is just Christianity in England is quite early, so there is no like really pre-Christian writing in England. So the first Christianizing missions to England start in the late 6th century, which is earlier than any surviving texts. So that by the time you get textuality, and that's part of why you get textuality in England, it's through Christianization.
Okay, so Wikipedia misled me. That's what you're saying, as it does quite often. Okay, good. All right. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about the content of the poem? So the story here. So I read it back in high school, and I remember the dragon and the Grendel fights. But what actually occurs within the poem, and what is the significance of all of that? Obviously, it's stories, but what does that mean for us?
Yeah, it's set in Denmark. It is structured around the career of this warrior named Beowulf. That's why we call it Beowulf. It doesn't have a title in the manuscript. A lot of early English poems circulate without titles. And it is structured around 3 monster fights. It sort of has a 2-1 structure. So in the first 2/3 of the poem, roughly, Beowulf battles this giant-like foe named Grendel, and then his mother in succession. And then in the last third of the poem, 50 years later, Beowulf battles a dragon. So the poem is intentionally lopsided. It doesn't have symmetry. It's 2 fights in the beginning, 1 at the end, 2 fights 50 years ago, 1 fight now, 2 fights against these sort of humanoid, giant, monstrous people that are never quite defined clearly. There's a lot of different sort of language used to describe Grendel and his mother. They're sometimes called the Grendelkin, whereas the dragon is much more clearly like other. It's just a monstrous, evil dragon. The language doesn't try to make it human. Like, for example, with Grendel, there's this word eglecha, which is often used of Grendel and translated monster, except it can't really be monster because at a few points in the poem, Beowulf is described as eglecha, and it's supposed to be a good thing, like he's fearsome. So there are these weird crossovers where like Grendel and his mother, but especially Grendel himself, weirdly resemble Beowulf. Like the language used of Grendel humanizes and domesticates him in this uncomfortable way, and that doesn't happen with the dragon. The dragon seems much more traditional. It's just a warrior against a sort of vision of avarice, right? The dragon's problem is that he doesn't want anyone to have his gold, so he represents what in a Christian context would be a sin.
Sure.
So that's the two-sentence summary of the poem.
Sure, definitely, components that did not come out as I was reading the translation. So is Grendel a monster, or is Grendel kind of a perverse human being? Who is this character, Grendel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what your frame of reference is. He resembles other kinds of foes from other traditions, like in the Scandinavian tradition, he would be classified as a troll, but that's not a word that is native to English and isn't used of him in the poem. The poem says he's of the kin of Cain, so he's a sort of monstrous progeny of the original murderer. And that, again, is a detail that like Christianizes the context of the poem. But the way he is described, he's stronger and bigger than average people. He's somehow evil and sort of like genetically evil. But his exact form of difference from a human being, from Beowulf and his comrades, is never delineated with like a classification that can click. And I think that's something that makes Grendel a really engaging and challenging presence in the poem. The dragon is cool. It's a really good dragon. It's a good scene, but there's something different about Grendel and his mother, but especially Grendel, that and there have been like these rehabilitation books that what is it, John Gardner's Grendel, that retell the poem from his perspective, because there is something even in the poem, even though it's telling you he's the enemy and Beowulf kills him and this is supposed to be a good thing. There's something in the poem that equates Grendel with the like sociality of the hall, because the poem says that his motivation for pillaging the hall that Beowulf comes to defend is a sort of envy and jealousy of the sociality of that hall, and hall culture is the culture of the earliest medieval English times. So you could hear it in that opening line. The worst thing you could do to a neighboring tribe is take away their mead benches. That's like totally cutting their legs out from under them.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that really humanized Grendel, at least for me when I was reading it, is this idea that, his mother then wants to take revenge. Mm-hmm. And his mother is kind of very touched by the fact that, her son has been killed by Beowulf. So I thought that was actually a really interesting touch in the sense that the mother seems to have, a human son, or maybe someone who's adjacent to a human in this case, and then Beowulf has to go out and kill the mother as well, because the mother is also seemingly evil. But I think that was the one thing in the poem that made me think, wow, Beowulf, or actually Grendel, sorry, not Beowulf, Grendel actually has a little bit of a human touch here. So why don't we talk a little bit about the mother character in the poem?
Yeah, so that in the same way that Grendel is a kind of like perverse turning inside out of the sociality of the mead hall, instead of being inside the hall and social, he's out on the moors and alone. Instead of being domesticated in the hall, he's wild out in the moor, in the fenlands. Similarly, his mother is enacting a kind of perverted inside-out version of like a revenge motif that would be very familiar to this poem's original audience. So many of the legends from the early Germanic-speaking countries are about vengeance. It's a very common motif, and it's a very like strong social value that at this time and in this place, that vengeance in some fashion, either by extracting payment or by retaliating, is justified after violence against one's kin. And so Grendel's mother's actually within the context of her own family, if you like. She's doing the right thing, but the poem represents it as more wild aggression. So it's a sort of like she's not allowed to avenge Grendel. He's supposed to be unavengable or unmournable in the poem because of who he is. There is one word that is applied to him that does have some specificity. He's called a thurs, which sort of means giant. It does mark him as, again, genetically other than a regular human. But yes, so she enters the poem as an avenging force, which is supposed to be, in the poem, it's supposed to be just another disaster for the Danes. But it does follow a cultural logic. It's like there's a script for vengeance that would have made sense to early medieval English audiences.
And then, after the fight with Grendel's mother, a lot of time passes. Beowulf is celebrated, made king. What is the rationale for skipping sort of 50 years of the poem and then all of a sudden almost bringing out this dragon, like Deus Ex Machina? What's up with the dragon?
Right. I mean, I guess by skipping 50 years, the poet is telling us that the hinge figure in the poem is Beowulf. He's the one who gets to traverse those 50 years. And that definitely makes the monsters secondary, the three foes secondary. But also by skipping those 50 years, the poem is not doing a kind of, equitable representation of his career. It's taking snapshots. And that's very much in keeping with the poem's style otherwise. So there are these three monster fights, but it would really, if all the poet wanted to do was to show us these three monster fights, the poem would not be 3,000 lines long. It would be like 1,000 lines long, maybe 800 lines. A lot of the poem is other stuff. It's dialogue that touches on lots of things that are not directly to purpose in terms of plot, and there are long digressions. Like the beginning of the poem is already a digression. Shield Shaving is not like a figure within the poem. He's just a legendary ancestor that the poet wants to name check out up front. And so this has frustrated some readers of the poem. It used to be a commonplace to kind of lament the fact that despite like this ought to be the English language's epic poem, but look how lopsided it is. Look how digressive it is. It has no sense of proportion the way that Homer did or the way that Virgil did. But it just turns out it's a different kind of proportion. It's the lopsidedness is kind of the point. The lopsidedness of a giant and a dragon, the lopsidedness of 50 years ago and 50 years later. It has a certain rough beauty of its own that is just dissimilar to the beauty of a very like vividly colored world like Homer gives us. It's the landscape in this poem is bleak the way that Denmark and England are bleak. The things that happen are tragic the way that things are tragic in the early Germanic tradition. But the poem has an internal logic that if you just can accept it, you can understand why, for example, the poet would skip 50 years. It's in keeping with a kind of digressive style.
What would you say the purpose of the digressions are, if any?
I mean, they add a lot of texture to the poem, right? Like there's this issue happening right now in Denmark that Beowulf is attending to, but there are also all these backstories about feuds and vengeance and slayings and people who became king and people who were murdered. And so it gives the poem a kind of layered sense. And that's actually part of why it has been so tempting to imagine that the poem was composed in layers, because it is in layers in terms of temporality. But probably we now think not because 10 different people contributed 10 different layers, but just because one single poet had this style, a digressive style of layering the past.
Sure. If you could leave our listeners with one big takeaway about Beowulf, what would that be?
Reading a translation is great. Looking across the page at the Old English is excellent. Look up a video or audio of someone reading it aloud so you can hear the language. And it's just an infinitely rich poem. We're lucky that lots of other poems, Old English poems, survived. But even if none of them other than Beowulf had survived, we would be very lucky.
Any other closing remarks about Beowulf? And then maybe let's move on to Gawain.
No, I think that's it for Beowulf.
All right. Well, let's go on to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I have my Simon Armitage translation over here, and let's talk a little bit about this thing. So we're flashing a little bit more into the future now. Let's first talk about maybe the tradition of Middle English and some of these knightly stories that we get in Gawain.
Yeah. So, I mean, like Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a story set in the distant past. Interestingly, they're actually set around the same time. But Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is much, much later in terms of when it was composed. It was composed in the mid or late 14th century. So at least 400 years after Beowulf and up to 700 years after Beowulf. And at this point, we're in the Middle English period. So it's a language that is strongly influenced by French and also influenced by Norse, because large parts of England in the 11th and 12th centuries were part of the Kingdom of Denmark.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about. So first thing I noticed with the structure when I open this thing is, so Beowulf, the Old English structure, it's structured with these breaks, the caesuras in between the lines, and then the Gawain and the Green Knight just kind of runs the line straight through, at least from what I'm seeing. Is there any similar breakage of the line in those kind of two parts, or is it closer to what we would see in modern English?
There actually is. So those as you said, the break in the middle of the line is called the caesura, which just means pause. And then the two halves of the line, we generally call them half lines. And especially in Middle English, we refer to the first one as the A verse and the second one as the B verse. Or sometimes people say the on verse and the off verse. But at any rate, yes, Middle English alliterative verse does have that same structure into half lines. It's just that our additions mask it. It's actually, as someone who works on meter, it annoys me because we know where the break happens. We're just,
Sure.
And in fact, in manuscripts, scribes will often write a little dot in the middle of the line. Like, it's important where that break happens. It actually helps you read it. It's easier to read when someone puts the break in because the break typically coincides with a syntactical boundary. So it helps your eye parse the poem. And it hasn't been the convention in Middle English studies to put it in. But it should be.
Okay. Does that exist in Chaucer as well?
Chaucer's lines have a different kind of caesura. So there is a caesura in iambic pentameter and its French and Italian precursor forms, but it isn't a division of the line into two halves the way it is in alliterative verse. It's a lighter caesura, so it has never been marked, and it generally isn't pointed in the manuscripts in the same way.
Okay, so it's more of a feature of the alliterative verse.
It's more of an alliterative thing, yeah.
Got it. Okay, interesting. All right. Well, why don't we read the beginning of Wait.
Great. So I'm reading from Andrew and Waldron's edition. This is the one that I teach from. So I don't actually teach Old English in my job because I have a colleague who does. So
Good diverse
it's
time.
fun. It's been a while it's been a while actually since I cracked Beowulf. It's fun to talk about it. But the Middle English stuff I teach all the time. So here is how Sir Gawain and the Green Knight opens. Sithen the siege and the assault what ceased at Troja, the Borg Britanid and Brent to Brondis and Askis. The tulk that the Tramis of Thrasown there rochte what's treed for his treachery, the trewest on earth. Hit what's Enias the Adel and his hige kinde, that sithen depressed provinces and patronus become a wellnech of all the wele in the West Elis. So after the siege and the assault had stopped at Troy, the city burned and roasted to ashes. The man who achieved there the intricacies of the tricks of treason was tried for his treachery, the truest one that ever happened. It was Aeneas the noble and his noble kindred who afterwards oppressed regions and became overlords almost of the entire wealth in the Western Islands. And the poem goes on from here to discuss other legendary founders. It talks about Romulus founding Rome and Langobard founding Lombardy. And then it finally gets to Brutus, the legendary founder of Britain. So the opening stanza of the poems sets so King Arthur is supposed to be like, again, 5th, 6th century. It's already a long time ago from the 14th century, but it's setting even King Arthur into a much deeper, really colonial history. It's locating England as like one, or Britain more generally as one outpost of a kind of Trojan diaspora, if you like.
Wow, yeah, I was actually very surprised at the reference to Troy in the very first line. Definitely, I guess, alluding to the epic tradition, and then we get into a little bit of the Arthurian legend. Do you want to give us a quick summary of the trajectory of the poem?
Sure. The poem opens with a New Year's party at King Arthur's court, and Arthur stands up and announces that before everyone dines, he would like there to be some pleasant surprise. The word is merveille, like a marvel, something wondrous should happen. And as if on cue, a knight rides into the court, dressed entirely in green, on a horse dressed entirely in green, and then the knight's skin and hair and eyes are green, and the horse is all green, and it's very unsettling. And he's also kind of like Grendel. He's twice as big as everyone else, so he's sort of giant-like as well. Half etain is the word, half giant. He seems to be. And he announces a challenge. He says, here's my battle axe. Arthur, why don't you take a whack at my head, and then I'll return the favor. And Gawain steps forward and says, no, I got this one. And he decapitates this knight, and who promptly bends down and picks up his own severed head, mentions that Gawain should seek him out in a year's time to return to get the counterblow, and rides off. So the poem opens just in the first 500 lines with this incredibly unsettling and dangerous encounter that obliges Gawain to spend a year contemplating his own mortality. And, similar actually to Beowulf, the way that 50 years just goes by in a sentence, that year goes by in like a stanza. So the entire poem is really about one day around New Year's and then like 5 or 6 days the next December. And it's carefully plotted, so you slowly get to New Year's the next year. And that intervening year, there's this beautiful stanza about the seasons changing, and it just, it really captures the quality of looking back after a year and thinking that went by in a flash.
Oh, wow. So in the Simon Armitage introduction, which I read, the first thing he says is, "We know next to nothing about the author of the poem that had come to be called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight." Mm-hmm. What's up with all these anonymous authors in this tradition?
Yeah, it's especially true of the alliterative tradition. When we have Chaucer and his friend John Gower, I taught a course on Chaucer and Gower this past spring. They're the beginning of a kind of unbroken tradition of courtly, named neoclassical English writers, specifically poets. And you can just trace it down, Chaucer and Gower, and then Hakluyt and Lydgate, and then Skelton and William Dunbar, and you can go on and on and on up to the present, but especially up through, I don't know, 1700, and it's unbroken. And the alliterative tradition, instead, like I said, it's defunct, and one of the symptoms of its being defunct is how much contextual information we've lost about the authors. Someone at some point knew these people, knew who they were, but they didn't put their names into their poems. They didn't have their names signed into their manuscripts in some way. Chaucer had the advantage of being a bureaucrat, so we have all of this public information about him. We know, in 1396 he worked as a forester, and he had this, we have like documents about him. And we know his name and his family and so forth. And we just don't have any of that for this poet, who we just call the Gawain poet. Or some people call this poet the Pearl poet because of the fame of the other sort of best poem. So it's one manuscript. It has 4 poems in it, and we're pretty sure that they're all by the same person. That's not certain, but most people accept that it's one person.
Sure. Well, okay, so we don't know who wrote it. So definitely there was do we know if this was also kind of an oral poem that was told, or was it written down? Do we know anything about kind of the way you get the poem? Oh, bless you.
Kind of similar to Beowulf. Within the poem, there are representations of oral delivery of maybe not literary texts, but oral performance in a great hall in Arthur's court. But like with Beowulf, there are so many details in the poem that show that the author was someone who would have been educated and literate. I mean, the author certainly knew French, because a lot of the details of the poem are borrowed from the French Arthurian romances, like those of Chrétien de Troyes. The author very likely knew Latin. Pretty much certainly, if you accept that all 4 poems are by the same author, because the 2 that are lesser poems, Cleanness and Patience, are homiletic poems that translate large tranches of the Bible. And the version of the Bible that are translating is the Vulgate Latin Bible. So the poet is an educated person, whether we don't even know if they were lay or clerical, right? If they were religious or not. That's not, you read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and you're like, probably not. And then you read the homiletic poems and you think maybe they were like a priest or something. So it's, even that is not, there's no consensus.
Wow. Okay. That's very fascinating. I definitely, never think about that, because I think in our world, we're so used to this idea of, art and author. And when we get a little bit of, this piece of literature that has been passed down for many centuries, and we don't even know who wrote it. That's definitely a little bit of a shock here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the content of the poem. So, what is the significance of this Green Knight coming in and, his head gets chopped off, and then also, I guess, a sort of revenge plot here when he comes back. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, what's different, what makes it not a revenge plot is that the Green Knight has issued this as an invitation. It's a game.
Sure.
And Gawain accepts the challenge and plays the game, and then is obliged on his knightly honor to to go seek out the Green Knight in a year. The knight says, "You will be able to find me. Just ask after the Green Chapel. I'm the Knight of the Green Chapel." And so the second part of the poem's in 4 parts, so it does have a certain amount of symmetry. The first part I've already narrated. The second part sees Gawain wandering in the northwest Midlands and around the coast, around the border with Wales, or at least as that border existed in the 14th century. So deep, forested provincial England and Wales, and he's wandering around looking for a sign of where to go. He's questing, but it's not the right kind of questing, because what he's questing for is possibly his own death. So the poem has a wonderful play between honor and stupidity. It's kind of the best version of, but also a parody of an Arthurian romance with its extremely serious-minded depiction of knightly honor. And so Gawain takes it all very seriously, but as transpires throughout the rest of the poem, not everyone else does. So there becomes this split between his own sense of self. He thinks he's in an Arthurian romance, and a lot of the other people in the poem are not so sure that that's the right genre.
Sure. Okay, do you want to elaborate a little bit about that? So why are the other people in the poem convinced that that's not an Arthurian romance?
Yeah. So in the third part of the poem, he arrives at a castle, and the host of the castle, the lord of the castle, says, "I know where the Green Chapel is. Don't worry. I can take you there in a single morning's ride. So you actually have some time. You have 3 days before you have to be there. So why don't you just stay with me?" And then this host mentions that they will also play a game. So there's a sub game. There's the beheading game that bookends the whole poem, and then in the third part, there's an exchange of winnings game. The host says, "Whatever I win, I'm going to go out hunting every morning, and whatever I win will be yours, and you stay in the castle, and whatever you win will become mine." And Gawain's like, "What do you mean? What I win? What does that mean?" And so the first morning, the lord goes out hunting, and Gawain is awoken by the lady of the castle, sneaking into his bedroom and chatting him up and asking to kiss him and flattering him and flirting with him. And so it becomes clear that what Gawain wins in the castle has to do with what happens between him and this lady. But it's all very triangulated, because according to the rules of the game, whatever happens between him and the lady, he needs to reenact with the Lord. So the poem has a very interesting queer angle in it, where Gawain's attraction to this beautiful lady is refracted by a sort of horror of, but then simultaneous attraction to same-sex desire with the Lord. So if he were to succumb and sleep with the lady, by the rules of the game, he would then have to sleep with the Lord. And that's that's what hangs over this part of the poem. It's his anxiety about that, and maybe readers' anxiety about that.
Okay, wow. And this, so we talked a little bit about, we don't know if this was written this was written by a clergyman or a layperson.
Yeah, we don't know.
But there's definitely a little bit of a lot of a Christian influence, and here are a lot of references to that traditional Christianity. So obviously that would have been seen as sinful, that sort of queer angle in this tradition. So that
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about that.
sure,
I mean, because also the poet has another poem called "Cleanness" or "Purity,"
sure.
that has a lot of representations, negative representations of same sex desire. And so, I mean, in general, the context for all of this, as you said, is a Christian culture, and it's a culture that, in the title of one book about this, it's before the closet. It's before a cultural discourse about sexual identity makes it possible to claim queerness as a lived, experienced identity that is putatively as valid as straightness. And so, but before that moment happens, this Christian language of sodomy is the available discourse for this. But I do want to point out that in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, unlike in Cleanness, where it's very sort of castigating towards same-sex desire, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it's all a game, and it's more complicated than just the same-sex desire being the like forbidden thing that prevents Gawain from sleeping with the lady. It is that, but it's also like the poet also spends a lot of time, like stanzas and stanzas of time in the first part of the poem describing how hot the Green Knight is. I mean, it's just, that's all the only word I can use. It's very clear in the Middle English. He's a really, really good looking Green Knight. And like, so why spend all this time describing how wonderful and handsome he looks when the people he's talking to in the court are almost all men? The poem is excessive in its attention to the possibility of specifically male desire in a way that I think is like surprising maybe to students, and also really engrossing.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's definitely something I didn't think about or pick up on as I was
Yeah.
reading. So thank you so much for pointing that out. I think this is a very interesting kind of parallel as well. Which actually brings me to my next question, or I guess might be a component of the next question, is why are these poems still with us today? Why do we still read them?
I mean, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight it's such a lush poem and has so many details in it. A lot of the stanzas are like lists of things, like lists of all the things on the Green Knight that are green, lists of all of the kinds of terrain that Gawain traverses when he's questing for the castle, lists of all the foods that they feed him at this lavish feast at the castle, long dialogue between him and the lady, long hunting scenes with the lord out hunting. And so it's a lavish, a verbally lavish poem, and has all these words in it that don't appear elsewhere. It's so exactly the opposite of Chaucer's kind of to the point neoclassical style. Instead, it's intentionally excessive. It's like there's no reason you have to keep going on about whatever topic it is, but the poet does go on about it in a loving way. Like the poet was a lover of details. Vladimir Nabokov once said, "Fondle details," and that this poet agreed with that advice. So I think that's why. And then also, that would, I think, be enough. It would be a very engrossing poem if it only did what I just said, if it had a ton of details in it. But it also has such, and the reason I'm also thinking of Nabokov, I think of this poet as Nabokovian because the plot of the poem is such a trap. So I haven't even kind of given it away yet, but you get all the way with Gawain to this castle where somehow everyone already knows who he is, and they're hosting him for 3 days, and they already know where he's going. They know everything about him. He knows nothing about them. So it's a situation of asymmetry. And somehow this lady is importuning him, flirting with him every morning. And then he finally does go to the Green Chapel, meets the Green Knight again, and the Green Knight heaves his axe 3 different times. The first time, Gawain flinches, so he stops and he says, "Wait, you can't flinch. That nullifies it." And the next time he stops again, and then the third time he just barely grazes Gawain's neck. And this is supposed to be payback for the one way in which Gawain failed to live up to the exchange of winnings game. Because on the third morning, the lady gives him a green girdle, and she says this girdle is magic, and it protects whoever wears it from being chopped to death. And Gawain thinks, this is just the thing. I'm about to get chopped to death, so I think I will accept this girdle and not surrender it to the Lord as something that I won in the castle. So he's breaking the rules of the game in order to ostensibly save his own life. But the poem never confirms whether the magic is real. There's a way to read the ending that makes the magic not real, that it was all just a trick to see if Gawain was truly as honorable as he was supposed to be. And that's the way he understands it. He feels like he failed the poem. But everyone else thinks it's a big joke. The Green Knight even says, oh, don't worry about it. You're making too big a deal out of this. When he goes back to Arthur's court, when Gawain goes back to Arthur's court and explains what has happened, everyone just laughs, and they all wear green sashes to commemorate this adventure of the green girdle. They don't think that he has messed up. So this is what I meant by the genre of romance being like in question by the end. It reads like a romance, except then at the end, Gawain is the only one who thinks that he should be judged by the standards of romance.
Thank you so much for all of that. Any closing remarks here on Gawain?
No, I mean, we're lucky to have several good translations of it. And similar to Beowulf, take a look across the page. There are a lot of words you could still pick out. And, just getting basic understanding of how to pronounce Middle English, you'll be able to sound it out for yourself too.
As I said, I watched some videos and read a little bit about that before today, so it's not that hard. I think our listeners are at home could definitely do so. All right, any last minute thoughts on the alliterative tradition? Anything else that we want readers at home to know about Gawain or Beowulf?
Without launching into a whole other half-hour discussion, I do want to put on viewers' radar a third poem that I think stands with these two as gems of this tradition, but is a very different kind of poem, and that is William Langland's Dream Vision, Piers Plowman. This is a poem that's occupied a lot of my brain space the last 10 years, and increasingly so. I edit or co-edit the journal dedicated to this poem, the Yearbook of Langland Studies. So it's a roughly 7,000 line poem. So it's actually longer than both Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's broken up into sections that are called passus, or steps. So the metaphor is of pilgrimage. And whereas Beowulf and Sir Gawain are martial poems, they're about fighting. Piers Plowman is about the most pressing worldly and spiritual problems that faced Langland and his contemporaries. It's about, how do I save my soul? It's about, what do we do with beggars in our society? It's about, how should priests behave? How can they be made to practice what they preach? It's about, tithing and Christian, Jewish, Muslim relations. It's about all these topics that would never come up in Beowulf or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And it's set in the present. It's set in the everyday world that Langland walked through. It's lots of it is set in London. Some of it is set out in the cornfields of the northwest and midwest of England, where Langland was probably from. So a little further south of where the Gawain poet is working. And it's a notoriously difficult, contorted, twisty poem, but it speaks to me because it's so politically urgent. It's a poem of intense political conviction, written at a time when not just Langland, but many people felt like the world was coming to an end. Plague had hit England in 1348. There are all kinds of interlocking crises happening in late 14th century England, and you wouldn't know that to read to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. it could have been written in a time of plenty, in a time of peace. But Piers Plowman, you couldn't possibly miss the sense of apocalyptic doom that the poem conveys.
Definitely relevant to us today.
Yeah, I was, the day the pandemic hit, I was going to start teaching this poem. It was like too real.
Wow. Well, we'll have to do another episode on Piers Plowman. We'll have you back for that next time.
Sounds great.
All right, Eric. Well, thank you so much. I definitely learned a lot about Gawain and Beowulf today and the alliterative tradition. And to our listeners over at home, definitely check out Gawain and Beowulf. These were two wonderful books that I revisited since, studying them in, I guess, high school. Thank you, Eric, once again, so much. You're listening to the Pens and Poison podcast, and we'll be back next time with more great literature.
All right. Thank you.